I want to welcome you all to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee, a place where freedom, reason, spirituality, and social justice all come together. I especially thank you for coming in this weather. We had planned this in April thinking, oh, this will be fine by then, but I guess I haven't lived in Wisconsin long enough to know that that's a very dangerous assumption to make. So thank you for coming, and I especially want to thank John Deere for coming all the way from New Mexico, and Reggie Jackson, who most of you probably have heard of, coming all the way from Milwaukee. After this event is over, the book signing and refreshments and book sale will be in the common room, which is to your right and my left. The restrooms also are on my left, your right. You would turn left and go left to a little hallway, and they'll find them. You should have gotten a little form when you registered. Okay, good. That is for your own use. You're not going to have to hand it in like homework or anything like that. We just want you to have something to hold on to after you leave, so it's not just, oh, wasn't that wonderful, and go home and forget about it. So this will give you, if you want, an opportunity to take in what you hear tonight and make some decisions. Completely up to you. We're not out to embarrass anyone. I would like to introduce our new senior minister, the Reverend Jennifer Nordstrom. But as I said, that she's not so new anymore, and she's certainly not old, but she is wonderful. So Jennifer will introduce John Deere. Thank you.
I am so delighted that you're all with us here on this snowy April evening. At the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee, we believe that every human being has inherent worth and dignity, and that what we do in this world matters. That's part of why we're so delighted to have our esteemed guest, John Deere, here tonight, along with Reggie Jackson. Here at the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee, we have a variety of beliefs about God, including no belief in God at all, but what we do believe is that we're part of an interdependent web of all existence. That's something that John calls us into and has called us into throughout the work of his life. Father John Deere is a Catholic priest who spent over 3 decades calling people into the work of nonviolence and peace work. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize not once, but twice already, and he's the author of more than 30 books. He's served as the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is the largest interfaith peace organization in the United States. And John has been arrested over 75 times for civil disobedience against war. I actually met John a number of years ago when I was on a speaking tour for the nuclear disarmament project of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. We were on a panel together in New Mexico speaking about nuclear abolition and peace about a decade ago. So it's a delight to meet him again on this different territory. I'm sure that John is as proud as I am of our colleagues with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons who were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Now, John's work is calling us to be faithful to the God of peace and the way of nonviolence by practicing what he calls eschatological nonviolence in our relationships with a threatened planet. His new book, They Will Inherit the Earth, which he's going to speak with us about tonight, develops nonviolence as a new frame for understanding the climate and environmental crises of our age. John, can you hear me through the wall? Father John Deere, will you come down?
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and thank you, Jennifer, for welcoming me here to the Unitarian Church. It's wonderful and a blessing to be back in Milwaukee, but it's cold outside, and I guess that kind of just emphasizes the point that we're all reflecting on about climate change, because it is, I think, the spring. I'm not sure. But I really want to thank my friend Elizabeth, who invited me here many months ago, and with Jennifer and their colleagues and friends made tonight possible. So a big round of applause for Elizabeth and Jennifer for welcoming us all together. And I'm going to speak about my new book, They Will Inherit the Earth, Peace and Nonviolence in a Time of Climate Change. And then my new friend Reggie Jackson will respond and reflect a little bit on Milwaukee and the history of racism here. So again, let's give a round of applause to welcome Reggie Jackson, who's here with us. You can look at myself. Well, and please, Jennifer and everybody, just call me John, because my name is so darn goofy. Father Dear just doesn't work, you know. It's too ridiculous. Like, no one takes me seriously. But I asked Elizabeth and Jennifer to put this little picture of Dr. King up here, because like you, I'm just so filled with his spirit tonight. I hope you are too, as on the eve of the 50th anniversary, when the government killed him. This holy prophet sent by God to us, greatest person in our history. So, you know, 50 years ago tonight, I've been thinking about this for 6 months when we first wrote about this tonight, Elizabeth. And I've talked about his speech every day of my life for 40 years, in every talk I've given. As you know, he said 50 years ago tonight in Memphis. Just before he said the famous line, I've been to the mountaintop, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. Remember when Martin said that? He said the choice is no longer violence or nonviolence. That's not what we're talking about anymore. It's nonviolence or non-existence. Those are the last words of the mighty prophet to us. And here we are 50 years later, seeing it all being played out, heading towards non-existence, full speed ahead. And what I want to invite us to tonight, after all we've been through in our own lives, in this terrible moment we're living in, that we're going to be the people that Martin called us to, and we're going to rise to the occasion and become those people of nonviolence and help lead humanity back from the brink of non-existence. What do you think of that? That's my hope and prayer for us. So, and thinking about him, you know, maybe I could tell you a little bit about myself and my journey with the Beatitudes, which led to this book, and then talk a little bit about the book and the climate change and the connection with all the issues. And then Reggie will reflect a bit with you, and then we'll take some questions. But I just really want to thank all of you for all that you do for justice and disarmament and creation and peace, for Milwaukee, for our poor country and the poor world. And I just want to encourage you to keep at it. Maybe that's the most important thing I could say. I'm 58 and grew up in North Carolina. My father was the local publisher. He was just 30 years old. I come from a big newspaper family. And when I was about 5, he came out in support of Dr. King and the civil rights movement and John Kennedy and all. So the local Ku Klux Klan threatened him by threatening to kill me. So I grew up with death threats from the Klan. My older brother and I received blood-stained postcards. Well, this was very helpful to clarify one's calling in life. I'm trying to make them laugh here, Elizabeth, and it's not working. And so then my uncle died, and my father suddenly became the head of the family newspaper business, so he moved to Washington, D.C., and overnight he was one of the leaders of the National Press Club. So I'm 8 years old, running around the National Press Club in the White House, Congress, and I'm appalled by everything, but totally politicized by being in this newspaper family, knowing everything about Dr. King at 8, 9, 10, Bobby Kennedy. We were out that night, and I wonder where you were, and I invite you to think about our teacher as I'm reflecting with you on these big questions. And it was the next morning, that Friday morning, my mother woke me up at 5 a.m. and said, Dr. King has been killed. You have to get out of bed now. It's time for you to get up. And I thought, okay. And she sat me in front of the TV, and I watched all of this. And my father said, I'm taking you downtown to see the riots and the curfew because you need to remember this. And then he took me to the Poor People's Campaign, the Resurrection City. And I kind of never recovered. And you go, oh, well, that's a little over the top. But with the death then of Bobby Kennedy, these events that changed our country. I mean, then you have the Vietnam War, and then you get full-on wars in, name it, Central America, nuclear arms race, Iraq, Reagan, Bush, Trump. This is inevitable progress from 50 years ago tonight, tomorrow. In my opinion, this is planned. And by the time I got to college at Duke in North Carolina in the 70s, where I majored in African American history, trying to figure Dr. King out, I decided, well, if they kill the greatest guy we got, there's no hope. And then I thought, well, if there's no hope, there's really no God. So I decided not to believe in God. And, well, it's a long, sad story, but one day I got knocked off the fraternity bar stool, saw the light, realized I believed in God, had to give my life to Jesus, and the next thought was I have to become a Jesuit. It's been downhill ever since. Anyway, my parents were so appalled by this announcement, I'm a wild college kid, that I'm now going to become a priest. They begged me not to, and I said, well, okay, I'll wait for a year, and what are you going to do? I got a job for the Robert Kennedy family, running their foundation. So I'm in that world, and I made a little money, and I said, I'm going to go off to hitchhike through Israel to see where Jesus lived. And I told my mother that. She said, it's worse than we thought. And the week I left to walk by myself and hitchhike through Israel to see where Jesus lived for 3 months, Israel invaded Lebanon. Do you remember the summer war of 1982? I'm trying to tell you the story of my book here. Who cares? Well, none of us remember it. We orchestrated it, and we killed 60,000 people in 3 months. And all the Holy Land tours were canceled. And I flew on a practically empty airplane to Tel Aviv and hitchhiked through Israel to see where Jesus lived. My goal to go to the Sea of Galilee. And there I was, and it's this beautiful place. If you've been there, there was nobody around. Big blue sea and the green fields and the blue sky. And there's a little church on the North Shore, smaller than this church. It was a Wednesday afternoon, nobody around. I walked in the church, and it said on the wall, like graffiti, if you can imagine, Jennifer, on the wall of the church, blessed are the poor. And then the next wall, it said, blessed are those who mourn. I thought, what is that about? Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those persecuted for working for justice. And I was utterly overwhelmed. I'd never thought about this my whole life. And I actually said out loud, oh my God, I think he's serious. I thought that was pretty funny, y'all. Because I was so dumb and naive, and I'm not that bright now. And I walked out in the balcony, and there's the whole Sea of Galilee, and it occurred to me, this is the job description of the Christian. And I was going to be a public Christian, and my plan was to be a nice, pious priest, which you see didn't work out. And he's saying you have to hunger and thirst for justice. You have to be willing to be persecuted for justice. You have to be a peacemaker. And I thought, okay, I'll do this on one condition. If you give me a sign, which was brilliant because I found a loophole because you don't get signs anymore. And all of a sudden there were these loud explosions and 3 big black Israeli jets fell from the sky, breaking the sound barrier, setting off sonic booms, boom, 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 and swooped down over the Sea of Galilee, killing people 15 miles away on the border of Lebanon. And I went, right, I'll get with the program. And 2 weeks later entered the Jesuits and was meeting my friend and teacher who just died recently, Father Daniel Berrigan. Maybe some of you remember Dan and Phil Berrigan, the legendary activists from the 60s and 70s. And well, you know, it's like a requirement of friendship with the Berrigans to get arrested. So,
I was first arrested with freedom.
oh, well, so you know, yeah. And, you know, I'm 21 years old, and Dan was like, go get arrested at the Pentagon, kid, and report back to me. And now I've been arrested like 80 times. I've done about a year in prison, constantly organized. It's like a way of life, in and out of jail and court. And I can't vote ever again. I can't travel to a lot of countries. I'm highly monitored by the government, and I have a serious problem with recidivism. Thank you very much. No, I'm just sharing you some of my journey. Well, anyway, I was involved in September 11th. I was living with Dan in New York now in the early 2000s. Went to volunteer, and by chance that met the head of the Red Cross. She asked me to coordinate all the chaplains working at the Family Center. And I was helping to organize the demonstrations against the U.S. impending war in Afghanistan. And there were so many complaints about this, about me, because the New York Times wrote about me, from benefactors to the Jesuits, that I was kicked out of New York City. And I had friends who lived in the desert of New Mexico who said, well, when they finally catch up to you and kick you out, come to the desert of New Mexico, because who cares? So I moved there. It's the poorest state in the country. It was the number one in nuclear weapons spending, nuclear weapons, military recruiting, child hunger, drunk driving, domestic violence, suicide. It's the worst place. Education, everything. There's 1,900 nuclear weapons at the Albuquerque airport, more than any place on the planet. And at Los Alamos, the birthplace of the atomic bomb, where the labs are now, land stolen from the indigenous people. It's down below the mountain, the Pueblo is the second poorest county in the country, and the labs are the second richest county in the country, more millionaires or PhDs per capita than any place on the planet, and business is booming. And I went there, and I've had a lot of the parishes, and we started a Pax Christi campaign to call for the closing of the labs, and this hasn't gone very well, hasn't gone over very well. But anyway, throughout all this time, this publisher asked me to write an anthology on Gandhi, to read his collected works and come up with, I thought, were his greatest teachings. Did you know Mahatma Gandhi, Hindu, read from the Sermon on the Mount every morning and every evening for 45 years? And he's not even Christian. Gandhi said, Jesus is the greatest person of nonviolence in the history of the world. That just kills me. I love that. And then poor Gandhi goes on and says, and the only people on the whole planet who don't know that Jesus is nonviolent are Christians. And I thought he's right. I think with like a Gandhian hermeneutic of understanding theology and Christianity and all the religions, the only thing you can say about Jesus is that he's nonviolent. I've come to the conclusion, working at the Fellowship of Reconciliation, that nonviolence is the heart of every major religion, and the future is interfaith nonviolence. So Judaism is all about nonviolence. They have this spectacular vision of shalom. The Isaiah prophecies, one day there'll be swords into plowshares and study war no more. Hinduism is embodied by Gandhi. Islam means peace. I know hundreds of Muslims radically committed to justice and peace through nonviolence because they're telling me of the Quran. And don't get me started on these Buddhists. You know, I know this great teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, for many decades now. And he says we're going to be totally living in the present moment of peace. We're only going to breathe in peace and show infinite compassion toward all sentient beings. And let's not even stop there. Let's show compassion to the earth and the air and the sky. Gandhi says even Christianity is about nonviolence. This is shocking. He said all the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount are the greatest writings on nonviolence in history, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. I want to be a person of nonviolence, so I have to read my handbook every morning and every evening, and that's what he did. Actually went to India with Gandhi's grandson, Arun, whom Gandhi raised. We went to the place where Gandhi prayed every morning at his ashram, because I was really interested in this. So I started reading the Beatitudes more. and teaching them and giving retreats on the Sermon on the Mount. And I wrote a book on the Beatitudes. And did you know that this scripture scholar from France, he says now, well, all the rage in scripture scholarship is trying to find the actual language Jesus spoke, the lost Aramaic. And this guy spent his life trying to figure out the Aramaic of the Sermon on the Mount. And he translated the Beatitudes back into the Aramaic, back through the Greek into French and English. And we're all wrong with the translation. Well, this just kills me too. It's not blessed are the peacemakers. And doesn't that sound a little patronizing? You're like, aren't you nice? It has like 5 different words in it. This is what Gandhi's reading every morning and every evening. Are you ready? Are you sitting down? Arise, get up, get moving, start walking, and walk forward. You who are poor and mournful and meek and hungry and thirsting for justice. This changes everything. It's total empowerment. Arise and walk on, you merciful, pure in heart, you peacemakers, you who are in trouble because you're working for justice. That's fantastic. Well, then I was working on my book on Thomas Merton, and Merton says that the 3rd beatitude, the translation, is all wrong. You all know who Thomas Merton is, the famous Christian monk writer. He wrote an essay in 1965 saying the 3rd beatitude, the translation should not be, blessed are the meek. Because that sounds passive too. And Merton, the great writer, says in the original Hebrew, Jesus is just playing with the Psalms, the images there, and Gandhi's reading this. It's not, blessed are you passive, gentle people. It's Kingian nonviolence. Active, creative, public nonviolence. That's the 3rd beatitude, the 3rd sentence of the 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, this, again, it just knocks me over. You're looking at me like this guy has been drinking way too much coffee. But you could see I get excited about this. And then I'm thinking about all this nonviolence of Jesus. You know, Jesus teaches this spectacular vision. And then he thinks he's Gandhi. He turns and marches to Jerusalem. He does civil disobedience in the temple. Well, you're going to be arrested and killed if you do that. And he's meticulously nonviolent. And he goes to his death in total nonviolence. And then he comes back and he's still nonviolent. Merton says, Jesus says, arise, walk forth, you people who are like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, of active, creative nonviolence. And then, this is what just does me in, this mind of the nonviolent Jesus connects active, creative nonviolence, like Martin gave his whole life trying to teach, leads to oneness with creation. The 3rd sentence, blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth. Isn't that spectacular? So I've spent many years now writing this book, and that's how I met Elizabeth, because she organized a conference here in Milwaukee called And God Said It Was Good, for theologians and scientists to reflect on theology and climate change 10 years ago. And I was very moved by that. And I got to thinking, well, what happens if you throw out the nonviolence of Jesus? Which we did in 315, when the horrible emperor theoretically converted to Christianity, which is an illegal religion. If you're a Christian, you get killed. And he throws out the Sermon on the Mount, turns to the Cicero, who justifies the wars for the empire, and comes up with the just war theory. And then we had holy crusades where we got to go kill all those people for Jesus. And for 1,700 years, we have nothing to do with the Sermon on the Mount, in my opinion, because I see it every day where I live on the mountain. The priests and the ministers bless the nuclear weapons at Los Alamos. Everyone there is Christian. And at the Pentagon, there's hundreds of Bible studies and masses every day, blessing war and killing. Well, if you do the math, if you're with me here, if Jesus, this imaginary, poetic person, links Dr. King's active nonviolence with oneness with the earth And we totally reject nonviolence as a way of life and a way of structuring the world, catastrophic climate change. And I was telling this to Bill McKibben, the great environmentalist, many years ago, and then again when we were at Standing Rock. And you see the blurb he wrote on my book. He said, nobody has talked about this, John. You're the first person who's connected Dr. King nonviolence with the earth. I said, no, it's right there in the gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount. And Gandhi saw that connection. That's why Gandhi started sleeping outdoors the last 25 years of his life. He literally wanted to be one with the earth. So I invite us to ponder these great themes, and that's what I've been trying to do with the book. And how can we go deeper into nonviolence in this moment, like Dr. King calls us to? And how are you making that strange, spiritual, human connection with oneness with creation? The promised land that Martin talked about. Isn't that beautiful to ponder? How can we reconnect those two? Now, we can talk tonight about... well, I like Harry Potter, Jennifer. I'd just say, he who shall not be named. I thought you'd laugh at that, but apparently it didn't work. Dangerous, cruel, greedy, war-making, racist, sexist, narcissistic, sociopath, and others like him. But he's a symbol, the worst we've ever had, but a symbol of the total insanity of violence that's plaguing the whole human race. We're in a culture of violence now that Martin said is headed toward non-existence. And so, that's why the news every day, we can't even keep up with it, but we could spend all night dissecting this. Total racism, police brutality, mass incarceration, total sexism, torture, executions, but permanent warfare. We're certainly bombing 7 nations tonight. We're actually probably bombing about 15, but actually we sell weapons to both sides in probably all 35 wars. We have over 750 military bases in over 150 nations around the world. It's permanent warfare that the Roman Empire could never even dream of. But that doesn't get it at all. The corporate greed that could lead to billions, 4 billion people in subhuman conditions. Without food, water, housing, healthcare, jobs, education, dignity. 800 million people starving to death tonight, the UN says. One can go on and on. We're talking, the treatment of immigrants, everything for guns, but nothing for stop gun massacres. There's so much to talk about. But we're going to use nuclear weapons on North Korea and just talking about that like that's a reasonable thing to say publicly. This is insanity. This is a real collective insanity where we're all losing our mind, or I don't even know the language to talk about it. And a permanent warfare on the earth so that 6 million species of creatures are about to go extinct. And catastrophic climate change is full on us now. It's full on us. This is what everybody's saying. And just to say a word about it, because I don't even like to talk about it. Who does? It's so overwhelming and depressing. But if we're going to rise to the occasion, we want to be people who have our eyes open and figure out how we're going to become more like Martin, people of full-on nonviolence. So it's, as I understand it, it's simply after 100 years of the fossil fuel industry digging up the oil, gas, and coal, well, you're filling the atmosphere with carbon, which is raising the Earth's temperature, which is melting the polar ice caps, which is raising the oceans, which is leading to storms we've never seen before, superstorms, hurricanes, rain bombs, and floods and fires and droughts. Well, 37% of the human race lives along the coast. Everyone in 100 years, and this is what was said even 10 years ago, will have to flee. And so hundreds and hundreds of millions of people are about to become refugees in the next few decades. This is just math now. And that's going to lead to 100 new wars over land and water. What we're doing is just beyond our imagining. And Elizabeth and so many of you could probably share even more about all of this. What do we do? Nothing can be taken out of the ground anymore, obviously. That's the whole point of Bill's 350.org movement. And the only way you can keep everything, the oil and the coal in the ground, and to still manage, is through alternative sources of energy, such as solar and wind, as you know. And the only way the whole planet is going to do that is through what Dr. King told us is the one way out. Global, grassroots, bottom-up, people power movements, the likes of which the world has never seen. Tonight, 50 years after his death, you and I invite us to commit ourselves to doing our part as part of that global movement. I think that's the hope. Dr. King says, there is a way out. There is a way forward. There is a way through. And I think you can trace it from Jesus to every religion, through every movement through history, up to Martin, and the thousands of movements happening tonight around the world. Active, creative, grassroots, bottom-up, people power movements of nonviolence. That's how change comes, not the top-down. From the abolitionists to the suffragettes, civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, then the explosion of movements from the women's movement, the environmental movement, people-powered nonviolence. And so I use this word because nobody talks about it, but he talked about this every single day of his life, and I invite you to talk about it in honor of him. What does it mean to become a people of nonviolence? It's not passivity. It's active confrontation with the culture of violence, working to transform it into something we yet can't even imagine, a new culture of nonviolence. Now, if Martin were here, he'd say, no, John doesn't get it at all. I'm sure. He'd go, nonviolence is power. We are not powerless. Oh, yes, we are, Martin. There's nothing we can do. And that's exactly what the culture of violence tells us and what we believe. And he says that's baloney. We have a way forward that if we can organize and wield this weapon of nonviolence, it always works. My friend, the guy who brought Dr. King to Memphis, Reverend Jim Lawson, who I met in jail 35 years ago, who then hired me as the director of FOR, he's in Memphis tonight. He called me last week, and I was telling him about I'm out speaking, I was going to be here. He said, he starts yelling at me about nonviolence on the phone. This was very exciting. He says, tell everybody it's just science. It's just science. We're so passive and believing that we are powerless, we don't use the way forward. Gandhi can get the British to leave nonviolently. King can end segregation in Birmingham nonviolently. Million people can take to the streets in Manila and get Marcos to flee in 3 days. Lima Gaboe, the greatest living person of nonviolence who won the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. I hope you all know who she is. She led the women's movement in Liberia against the horrible dictator Charles Taylor, who killed 200,000 people. She said, I just want all the women in the country just to take to the streets and let's just sit down and just say that's that. And gosh, they did. And Charles Taylor laughed at her, and 2 weeks later he fled. And they elected the first women president in Africa. This is impossible to do. King says anything is possible through the methodology of nonviolence. It's a political methodology of social change if we organize. And that's what I am learning, and that's what I was trying to write about in my book. What does this beatitude mean? And how can we begin to make the connections when we're all so disconnected and so hopeless and feeling so powerless in this terrible moment? And what are we going to do? I invite us to rise to the occasion. And isn't that what we saw last week on March 24th with the Parkland students, showing us how this works? You know, this is impossible that a group of kids who are totally destroyed with PTSD, within 24 hours, they're staying up all night. They've rented an office at the mall. They set up web accounts and Twitters. George Clooney is sending money. They got $10 million. And they changing the world. And we just keep at it, and then nonviolence becomes contagious, and then possible becomes possible, and maybe probable, and then inevitable, and then actual. That's the plan. What do we do in the face of climate change? Well, Jesus says we connect the dots. So maybe in my book, I talk about what happened was the war in Iraq was happening. I stepped down from the parishes and I started to travel the country and speaking and organizing more. But my Pax Christi friends found me this little adobe house way off the grid on the mountaintop south of Santa Fe at 8,000 feet. It's an old handmade house with a brick floor and wooden ceilings and an adobe fireplace and all glass walls looking out at 100 miles of pristine New Mexico landscape. And it's overwhelming. And there's no road to get there. It's literally completely impossible to find. And I've been there for 15 years now. And the first night, the house was surrounded by coyotes, and they started howling, and I jumped and hit the ceiling. It was so scary. Now I go out and howl with them. I'm trying to make them laugh here, Elizabeth, and it's not working. Well, I'm pondering these connections, and that's what led me to this book. What does Jesus mean? What can we learn as Gandhi learned from going back from these texts of nonviolence? We could look at all the texts of the world's religions or the lives of our great teachers. And so I wrote about life on the Mesa. I spend time periodically working at the little church in Yosemite, which is why Yosemite's on the cover. And it's such a beautiful place, maybe the most beautiful on the planet. I don't know if you've been there. But 1/3 of the trees are dead. It's about to completely burn down. And from living there and not being a tourist, it's just changed. What's happening to the creatures there and the water. The waterfall stopped for the last 7 years. It's incredible. And then, my friends, I went to the pueblos to meet with the indigenous women who have been resisting Los Alamos, but they're dealing with poverty and racism and militarism. They have the highest cancer rate in the world because the radioactive waste is being dumped on them. The women are dealing with the sexism of the men. They've got nuclear weapons. The land is poisoned. I mean, they're dealing with everything. And I went to them and said, what did Jesus mean by this third beatitude? And they look at me like, oh, you're just pathetic because you don't understand. It's so natural for them. The life of nonviolence is oneness with creatures and creation. I loved that. And I talk about my friends in the inner city of Oakland who've been resisting gun violence and racism and war all their lives. The worst, most violent block in Oakland. These are old friends of mine. And they said, well, there's none of them what we're doing is working. So they got everybody in the neighborhood to agree, and they dug up the alleyway behind the houses on their block. And they planted a garden. And it had this massive garden and gave everybody food, and it began to build community, and it made everybody nonviolent, and it's dropped all the gun violence and the drug dealing, created blocks of nonviolence. Mythic. And then I talk about my time at Standing Rock, which is one of the greatest experiences of my life, to go out there and be with the people who are resisting the pipeline. And then what the great religions are teaching about nonviolence and climate change, beginning with Pope Francis's great encyclical, Laudate Si. Maybe I could just end with a few lessons that I'm learning in the book. In light of all of this, in light of our great teacher, and trying to make the connections in our own life, I've come to the conclusion, and I don't know if this will be helpful, but this is why I'm going around talking about it, is the first step in all of this from now on is grief. This is the appropriate spiritual discipline. And in the United States, we're not allowed to grieve. We're supposed to, I saw that at September 11th. Remember when the president came on and said, stop all your crying and go shopping. And in New York City, all the compassion stopped, and we all raised the flag, and we got war making again. It's true. Or we're angry as activists, Or we're despairing. Or we're afraid. If you read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, because he's trying to form nonviolent activists, whatever you do, don't get angry, don't despair, and don't be afraid. And I'm like, those are our best things. The two emotions he recommends are grief and joy. The sentence before this third one is, blessed are those who mourn, they will be comforted. If we care about our 7.2 billion sisters and brothers on the planet, and the creatures and Mother Earth. We're grieving, friends. We're grieving because of what's happening. And we have to, if we're going to grow up and now, try to reach the holistic heights of Martin Luther King, of nonviolence, we have to take quality time, I say at least once a week, when you're out for a walk or in your quiet time, to grieve for Mother Earth. Maybe then, according to the teachings of all the religions, our cold hearts will break and we will begin to feel a little pain, and our hearts will open, and we might begin to feel some compassion. And that's our goal, universal compassion. And compassion always leads to action, action, action. So that's the second point. We have to come like Jesus and Gandhi and Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King, all our teachers. We have to become people now, I invite us to, of total nonviolence. How's that going for you? In my book, The Nonviolent Life, I talk about being really nonviolent to yourself. We're not going to beat ourselves up anymore. We're not going to cultivate interior violence. We're going to forgive everybody who ever hurt us. And we're going to be merciful and kind to ourselves and make peace with ourselves and give the God of peace a place to live within us. And secondly, we're going to practice meticulous interpersonal nonviolence toward every human being we know in Milwaukee and on the planet and all the creatures and the Mother Earth. How's that going for you? Because, we're all for peace and love, but deep down we'd like to get back a little revenge. I'm just saying. And third, at the same time, you have to be part of the movement, the grassroots global movement of nonviolence. If you're not, your silence and complicity is part of the problem. Just being nice is not nonviolence. You have to be engaged in the struggle somehow. And this is what Martin is trying to teach us. And it means hard things. We have to get rid of our guns. We have to quit the military. We can't send our kids off to the military anymore. We need to be resisting every form of violence in the culture. And next point, number 3, really deepening our solidarity with the earth and the creatures as a way to begin to learn how to be healed into people of nonviolence. That's why Thich Nhat Hanh teaches this beautiful Buddhist teaching about mindfulness. And I think we all have to learn that, to be really present to the creatures and Mother Earth. And you live here on this most beautiful lake, in such a beautiful state, with so many terrible problems and so much beautiful creation and so many beautiful people. We want to connect the dots in our own lives, make that beatitude connection. That means we have to look at what we eat and what we wear and how we live, and do everything from recycle to avoid plastics to try to go solar to becoming vegetarians, which is critically important to the environment. Unfortunately, I have to bring that up. I'm sorry about that. Find a local group that will help us. We can't do this on our own anymore. We need creative communities that will help us sustain this life, and connecting the dots. And this is what I wrote on Common Dreams to the students of Parkland last week. We're against racism and gun violence. We're against war and killing and hunger and the corporate greeds that leads to such global injustice, and therefore nuclear weapons and the destruction of the planet. We have to see that it's all one spectrum of violence. Really what we're up against, as Daniel Berrigan taught me, is death as a social methodology. And everything is a metaphor of death, how we're bringing death to the earth and the creatures and our sisters and brothers. You and I want to reach this mature level of Dr. King to say, remember how he was against racism and poverty and war in the end, and we're going to add the earth and sexism and nuclear weapons and the whole shebang. And that leads us to action. And that's really my hope and prayer for all of us. If you've been involved in the struggle for justice and peace, even your whole life, great. Thank you so much. Now you got to double your efforts. Triple your efforts. Joan Baez said that last week on NPR. I don't know if you heard her. She said, whatever you're doing, double it, triple it, or quadruple it. Michael Moore says Saturdays are for marching from now on. I think this is our new normal. our new ordinary. Everybody has to be involved in the struggle for justice, disarmament, and creation. Everybody's got to do their bit. Everybody can make a difference. Everybody can be Rosa Parks, that tipping point person, the Parkland students that can help the movement suddenly become contagious. That's how nonviolence works. If you saw the brochures that we passed around, this is my little commercial plug. The group that I work with, Campaign Nonviolence, we've been trying to do this around the country, and maybe some of you have been here in Milwaukee. 5 years ago, it didn't seem much was happening, so my friends and I said, let's call upon the country to take to the streets in the third week of September around International Peace Day. Once a year, we're going to have a national week of action against everything. Racism, police brutality, war, hunger, corporate greed, nuclear weapons, poverty, environmental destruction, and for Martin's vision of a new culture of nonviolence. And gosh, people responded. This September, the 15th to the 23rd, as you can read in your brochure, will be our 5th National Week of Action. And we're on track for over 2,000 marches, demonstrations, and events all around the country in all 50 states. I hired a big PR firm. I can't get any press coverage about it. Even my friend Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Won't cover it. It's very interesting. It's more interesting to cover the bad news. But people are responding, and I invite you here in Milwaukee to use this as an organizing tool, a week of action. Have you heard of a place called Little Rock, Arkansas? Last September, they had 35 events. It's changing Arkansas, and it helped with the vote that happened in the fall. Wilmington, Delaware had 62 events. I invite you to think of this as an organizing tool. It's really great. Secondly, we're calling for a national march on Saturday, September 22nd, from the Martin Luther King statue. We're going to walk in pairs in strict silence, like Gandhian satyagrahis, after we hear Jim Lawson give us a speech at the statue of Dr. King, right to Lafayette Park, to the Blight House, where we'll engage in nonviolent direct action, illegal activity, and you're all cordially invited to join me. And the third thing that we're doing is we're calling for nonviolent cities. And I invite you to think about this here in Milwaukee. A few years ago, I was in Carbondale, Illinois, of all places. And those activists, things were so grim, they weren't getting anywhere. And they said, well, what would Martin say would be the future of our city? And he'd say, well, everybody in Carbondale would become nonviolent. And they said, that's a good idea. So they started to promote the idea of a nonviolent Carbondale and started to meet with the city council, and then the mayor, and then the police department, and then the school system, and then the library system, and the healthcare system, and every facet of civic society. And now the whole city has a vision of where they can go. So we've called the whole country to take this idea. This morning, some of the key activists in Chicago have announced that they're going to pursue nonviolent Chicago. We just launched Nonviolent Cincinnati. 400 people came out for the evening. And St. Paul, Minneapolis is working really hard on it too. I think Milwaukee could do this too. And I'm talking about a vision of where your city, which has so many problems and so much beauty and so much potential, could go. You know, this is taking Dr. King to another level. And I'm just inviting you to do this. Well, you're looking at me like, well, good luck with all that, John. That's just really nice, but we wish you well. But do you know, Jennifer, what Dr. King said 50 years ago, 2 weeks ago? When he arrived in Memphis, he was feeling no hope, if you know the life of Dr. King. In the end, he knew that his days were numbered, that they were going to kill him. And he never talked about hope in his whole life. And it sounds sort of flippant, but he sort of didn't have to, because everything he did worked. I mean, as he said, the zeitgeist was upon him, but not in the end, when he started to really make the connections and say it's racism and war and the economics and our cities and our country, but it's Vietnam and the whole world. Well, that was his days were numbered. So he arrived in Memphis, and he said in his opening remarks, tonight I'm going to give you my definition of hope. How do you define hope in this terrible moment that we're living through? What does it mean for you? You know, Dan Berrigan told me as a kid, if you want to be hopeful, you have to do hopeful things. And I loved that. But Martin said, hope is the final refusal to give up. Hope is the final refusal to give up. I think it's a very profound spiritual teaching, and it takes us into a level we don't understand. We are going to keep working for justice and disarmament and creation and practicing nonviolence and making the connections and joining hands with one another and building up this global grassroots movement of nonviolence, even though we may not live to see any of the victories we hope for or imagine. We're just going to do our 1, 2, or 3 things for justice and peace creation, for Milwaukee and humanity and creation every day, and we're going to keep going forward, and it's going to become contagious because we're going to sow seeds of nonviolence for a future, a harvest of justice and peace we may not live to see. But this is the will of God. I think this is the spiritual life. And if you don't like that language, I think this is what it means to be a human being, even in these days, especially in these days. I invite us not to give in to despair, not to give up, not to go into the privilege of there's nothing that can be done, but to break open our hearts to universal compassion, universal love, universal nonviolence, eschatological nonviolence, where we're going to live way beyond America into the kingdom of God, here and now, at one with the creation, with our sisters and brothers and the species, with the whole beauty around us, and walk forward into a whole new world of peace and justice, no matter what. That's my hope and prayer for all of us, and I think that's the best way to honor Martin Luther King and Mother Earth. Thank you so much for being part of it. Arise and walk on. Thanks for listening, everybody.
John, I think they liked what you had to say. When I heard John talk about connecting the dots, it made me think about the intersections of all these issues. And being here tonight at the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee, talking about climate change and nonviolence, when we used to talk together about the abolition of war and nuclear weapons, and how all of these issues overlap and intersect. What is the relationship between white supremacy and patriarchy? What's the relationship between patriarchy and militarism? What's the relationship between militarism and the economy? How do these things intersect and overlap? How does it affect my being and my reality to live at the intersections of multiples of these places? When John talked about active, creative nonviolence, I felt all of the little atoms in my body start to move around and jump and get excited, and I felt my spirit rising and getting excited about doing all sorts of activities with all of you sitting here in this room. And then when he said, it leads to the oneness of creation, I felt that energy in my body relax down and sink into the earth and feel a deep sense of peace and connection. And to feel both of those, the excitement and the outward horizontal atoms connecting with one another, building and creating, and the deep connection and peace of oneness with all of creation, that is the intersection I hope we can build here together in a local community in Milwaukee. John said, find a local group. Hey, we've got one here. It's called the church. If you want to know more about us, there are little red pamphlets at the back. We're Unitarian Universalists, but find a local group and work here in Milwaukee to create a better world. And I am sure that Reggie is going to give us some more concrete steps about what that might look like. I'm going to introduce you to Reggie Jackson now, who is the head griot of America's Black Holocaust Museum. He served on that museum's board of directors from 2005 to 2017, including 2 terms as chair, and he has been a sought-after speaker for organizations around the Midwest for over 15 years now, so we're very lucky to have him with us here tonight. Reggie was the 2015 winner of the Eliminating Racism Award from Southeast Wisconsin's YWCA, and the 2016 winner of the Courageous Love Award from the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. He was awarded the 2017 Frank Zeidler Public Service Award from the City of Milwaukee and was the first recipient of the first annual Micah Legacy Award in 2018. Reggie Jackson is also a regular author. He's the author and contributor for the Milwaukee Independent. He's got a Milwaukee Press Club Award. He's written and edited in a variety of mediums about segregation in Milwaukee and its impact, and we are delighted to have him here with us. Let's give a hand to Reggie Jackson.
Thank you all so much. It's great to be back in this space. Actually, the last time I was in this space, I was getting an award, so wow, it's great to be back here. Very good memories. And as I look out onto the audience, I see a lot of familiar faces. I see a lot of people that I know here in Milwaukee that are doing the exact type of work that John mentioned, this hard work that requires so much of us as individuals. And as John was sharing with us the stories of Dr. King and Gandhi, it reminded me of my childhood. I was born in Mississippi and moved to Milwaukee in 1973. And as a little boy, I was very quiet. I kept to myself. And my favorite toys, by far, no other toys compared to these, were these little green army men. How many of you guys remember those little green army men? I literally had thousands of those. And I used to go out into my backyard and I would play war in the backyard all by myself. I had little tanks and little jeeps and pieces of artillery and these thousands of little army men, and I would set up these battles in the backyard, and everybody kind of looked at me like I was crazy, but I absolutely loved it. I didn't really know why, though. I knew that I came from a military family. My great-grandfather served in World War I. All of my mother's uncles served in the military in either World War II or the Korean War. So I came from this background where violence was celebrated. This idea that to be in the military, to fight for our country was a noble thing. And I grew up as a young boy feeling that myself. I can remember that by the time I was in 4th grade, my best friend and I knew the Marines hymn by heart. We used to just walk around randomly singing this stupid song. And I knew where every Marine base in the United States was by the time I was in 4th grade. I looked it up in the encyclopedia. So I had this mindset that these things were noble things. And I remember years ago I read something that really resonated with me about violence. There's a book, and it's my favorite book in the world. It's called Frantz, Fanon, and the Psychology of Oppression, written by a man by the name of Hassan Bulhan. And in this book, Bulhan does something that I don't think anyone else has ever done in the way that he did it. He redefined violence. He said that violence is anything that occurs, any process that occurs that leads to premature death. Whether that's war, police brutality, cancer caused by environmental racism, anything that leads to us dying early, he considers to be violence. So when we talk about nonviolence, we have to expand the idea of nonviolence to include things other than just nuclear disarmament. I served in the U.S. Navy for 6 years. I was on the most famous ship in the Navy, the USS Missouri. We traveled around the world. This was a ship that the Japanese signed a surrender at the end of World War II on in 1945. Ronald Reagan recommissioned the ship in 1986. I traveled on that ship for 4 years. And every time we left the port in Long Beach, California, we went to rearm the ship. We went to one of two places to get missiles. We had 32 Tomahawk missiles on board that ship. And we always knew when we left, we were going to go to one place or another to get those Tomahawk missiles. We figured out pretty quickly that if we went to one place, we were getting non-nuclear Tomahawk missiles. But if we went to this other place, we were getting the Tomahawk missiles with a nuclear tip on them. And we figured this out pretty quickly. And I can remember in 1987, we left to go to the Persian Gulf to escort Kuwaiti oil tankers through the Persian Gulf as part of this massive force that we stopped and got nuke Tomahawk missiles, 32 of them. And we rode thousands and thousands of miles away from our homes in the United States. And we had the capability at that moment to destroy millions of people's lives. I didn't think about it in that way when I was, serving in the Navy. I was thinking that this is an honorable thing to do. This is a good thing to do. But I never imagined years later I would look back on that service and feel a great deal of pride that I did serve my country, but also looking at it as being a tool. Dr. King said a lot of things during the course of his life. To me, the words that got Dr. King killed were these words. He talked about how he went into the ghettos of the North and talked to young people about nonviolence, and they came back at him and said, well, Dr. King, how can you tell us to be nonviolent when you're not telling the country to be nonviolent in Vietnam? What about Vietnam? And he described the United States by saying these words, that this nation is the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet Earth. I believe those are the words that got Dr. King killed, because he exposed the idea that his movement, this nonviolent movement, should be expanded beyond just thinking of the violence that's occurring in the South and the North, this violence against black people, to expand it to look at what are we as a nation doing? How are we exposing ourselves as Christians to being complicit in this violence around the world by supporting our government? We're fighting wars around the world. We have U.S. troops in 140 to 150 countries currently as we speak. We're launching drones into 7 or 8 different countries on a daily basis. And we sit back and we're not concerned. We sit back and we watch CNN and MSNBC and we listen to Democracy Now! And we watch all of these news programs, and we don't seem to be concerned about the masses of humanity. These billions of people that are suffering due to the policies of the government that we support on a daily basis. And when I think of what John talked about, the work that's required, the work that requires us to double, triple, quadruple our efforts, I think that it goes beyond that, because what I think we have to do, and this is the work that I've been trying to do, we have to expand the reach of what we consider to be violence and work on all of these issues that impact people dying early. So when we look at the city of Milwaukee and we find out that we have 72,000 homes that have lead laterals that are poisoning our children on a daily basis, and we're not forcing our elected officials to do anything about it, we're being violent to those children. We just don't recognize it. Why is it that the city of Madison can get rid of all of their lead laterals, but the city of Milwaukee has gotten rid of none? How is it that we can talk about the crisis of lead in Flint, but we don't talk about the crisis of lead in Milwaukee? What are we doing? How is it that we are sitting by allowing environmental racism to exist around the country to impact people of color on a vast level, but not speaking out against it? And yet we come together in groups and we work on all of these issues. We talk about mass incarceration. We talk about all of these important issues, police violence against people of color. But the reality is it's a much bigger problem than what we've led ourselves to believe. If we're going to do this work, I've told people that this is a mistake we make. We see this huge problem. It's an iceberg worth of a problem. It's humongous. And what we do is we go out in a little boat and we have a little hammer and a little chisel. And what we do is we chip away at this huge iceberg and we go home at night feeling great, like we really did something. But the reality is we're doing nothing. Unless you invite 1 million people to get in little boats with little chisels and little hammers to come along with you, you're doing nothing. That is what we are required to do. We have to get more people involved. Look around this room tonight. How many young people are in this room? Very few. We have to figure out a way to get our young people into the mindset where they recognize they have the ability to make changes happen. Not just those young people from Parkland, but young people around the world have the ability to do it. They are going to be the change agents of the future. Those of us that are my age and older, there's only so much we can do unless we bring those young people up to the same standards that we have in terms of making them recognize that it's imperative upon them to make the world that they want to have as older people. They have to make it happen. We have to train them. We have to educate them. We have to teach them. We have to use the ideas that John talked about, these philosophies that we all are familiar with. We have to find a way to infuse that into the hearts and the souls and the minds of our young people. Because if we don't do it, and if we don't do it very soon, it's going to be too late. It's going to be too late to make changes happen. We have to light a fire under the behinds of these young people. So what I challenge each of you to do when you leave tonight, make it a point that when you do the work that you're doing related to social justice, to nonviolence, whatever realm you're working in, find a way to bring along young people. You have to do it. Thank you.
So now we're going to go into that beloved Q&A session.
Thank you. I am James Elder from the Wisconsin Poor People's Campaign. I appreciate the good words from the two speakers tonight. John, I would like to ask you, in your long history of civil disobedience and engagement, and the moral aspect of this fight that you've been waging for decades, at what point did you face your greatest despair and discouragement along the path to where you are today?
Yeah, thank you so much, James. And you're with the New Poor People's Campaign. That's great. I hope everybody here will be part of it. You must know my friend George Martin. And George is on our board of directors with Campaign Nonviolence too, and he couldn't be here tonight. That's a powerful question. With civil disobedience, the greatest moments of despair. Is that what you're asking me? So I just can't figure the whole thing out. And I was not that bright. I'm still not. When I was 21 and just reading the Sermon on the Mount and meeting Daniel Berrigan, I looked at, okay, I'm interested in people. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Daniel Philip Berrigan, these great mythic peace and justice people. What do? Well, they all wrote books. So I started writing books. They all gave talks. I started giving talks. They all got arrested. So I figured it was just part of the job description. But I learned, if you study the movement history, that from the abolitionists, the suffragettes, even the labor movement of the 30s, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and up to today, like ACT UP or, so many movements. In the end, the positive social change happened when good people broke bad laws and accepted the consequences. First time I was arrested, I was at the Pentagon. And it's just a really nonviolent, symbolic act to sit in like that. For me, it was as a Christian, I was trying to follow Jesus, who clearly walked into the temple, turned over the tables of the money changers, totally nonviolently, totally civil disobedience. He was not passive. He didn't hurt anybody. He didn't kill anybody. But wow, is he dramatic, in-your-face, illegal activity. And then I was studying it. I wrote a book on it, which you can't find now. It's called The Sacrament of Civil Disobedience. And I discovered 15 different categories of civil disobedience in the four Gospels. Then I came to the conclusion everything Jesus did was illegal. He was just a one-man crime wave walking through the Roman Empire. So that just made things worse. And I don't even know where to begin. In 1993 with Philip Berrigan and two friends, it's over the top, Reggie, but I walked onto the Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina, which is the headquarters of the whole Air Force. It was the middle of the night. There was a big sign that said, "Trespassers will be shot on sight." Right through 10,000 soldiers. There's 75 of these fighter bombers, each carrying nuclear weapons. And we went up right through the whole darn thing. We just walked right in. And there's one of the fighter bombers, and I pulled out a hammer, and I went up to the side of it, and I swung once. Didn't even chip the paint. And for that act, I faced 20 years in prison. I was convicted of several felony counts, and I'm as high up a terrorist in the government as you can be in the United States. That's the way the government is. It's really helped clarify my relationship with the government, but I better not go there. So I was arrested and in a cell the size of this area right here, about 7 feet by 4 feet, and never left the cell for 8.5 months. Once a week, we'd get maybe a 10-minute visit, and my lawyer was Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General, and it took him 2 months to get a Bible in. And, that was very exciting. And, it was the worst experience of my life and the greatest. And I'm with Philip Berrigan, who's been on the cover of Time magazine. And, after like a couple of weeks, and we're like teachers of nonviolence, we're ready to go at it with each other. And we haven't left the cell. We had to do a formal check-in time at 6 a.m. And the question was, "So how was your day yesterday?" I'd been with them in the bathroom like for all day. I thought you'd laugh at that, but it was pretty funny, And when as a kid, my friends and I, we were totally over the top. We used to memorize Martin Luther King's speeches. And I remember one day in the cell going, in Martin's famous Detroit speech in 1963, "Nobody wants to go to jail. But when they throw you in jail, you will enter in those dungeons of darkness and despair and transform them into havens of harmony and hope." And I'm going, I don't think so, Martin. But I found, you remember in the airplanes in the old days, you got the little plastic cup of grape juice? And we had for breakfast this thing that was given to us called a slice of Wonder Bread. And we found that if you put the grape juice in the top of the toilet and hid it there, it fermented quite nicely over time. And once Ramsey got the Bible in, we started reading the Gospel of Mark, and then we'd break the bread and pass the cup. And it seemed to me Jesus was sitting right there in the cell with us. I'm just saying. I'm just reporting. And it was a daily roller coaster experience of emotions. My life is over to this is the greatest thing anyone ever could do with their lives. And I learned so many things. For one thing, there's an inverse proportionality to Kingian nonviolence. Unfortunately, the more I try to do, and I'm going to do it, we're going to end these wars and stop this stupid racism and clean up this poverty and clean up the world, the less happens. Because I'm in charge. The more I let go and let go of my life and surrender to the struggle for justice and peace and nonviolence and total blindness and take a step forward, in risks and sacrifice, the more happens. Forgive me for being a name dropper, but I got 5,000 letters in those 8 or 9 months in the cell. And every single one but 2 said, I feel so sorry for you. You're suffering in jail. And I'd read it and go, I feel sorry for me too. It's so awful. But I got 2 letters which were the opposite. All of them. And they were in the same week. Do you all know who Joan Chittister is? She's the famous churchwoman, probably the most important churchwoman on the planet. And she's a longtime friend. And Mother Teresa, whom I knew very well. They both wrote to me. And Mother Teresa's letter from Calcutta is, Dear John, oh, thank God you're suffering in jail. I'm so happy you're miserable and suffering. This just makes me so happy and joyful. Now we're getting somewhere. And Joan Chittister, the same thing goes, this is really great you're in prison and suffering. I had to read it, but it still scares me. And she said, you're reminding us, she was reminding me what I was trying to do, that the way to justice and peace is through the Paschal mystery of Jesus, the cross and resurrection. These are deep waters. I could tell, I don't like going to jail. Last year, Shane Claiborne and I and our friends from Black Lives Matters and the anti-death penalty movement, I mean, being in D.C. for the inauguration, it was like a potpourri of peace and justice activities. We went to the Supreme Court to shut it down, as you do, and we held a big banner the size of this wall. You can see it on Facebook, saying, Stop Executions. It was on the 40th anniversary of the modern death penalty era, which is around the time of the Trump inauguration. And gosh, James, we brought roses. We were nice church people. We were so friendly. We had a nice banner. What's not to like? They arrested us and put us in chains and chained us to the wall. And then were really rough with us, and several people were hurt. And then they threw us into the cell, the D.C. Central Cell Block, which I've been in many times. I don't know if you've been there in Washington, D.C. It hasn't been cleaned since 1841. And the cell was this big. This is just last year. I spent all of last year in doing community service. The cell, there's a bench here and a bench here and the toilet here, and the whole cell was covered with cockroaches. And the whole light was there, the fluorescent light. And we were all people of struggling with nonviolence, but Gandhi didn't mention the cockroaches, nor did Dr. King. And we had to figure out, and then the word was being passed out, if you're nonviolent to the cockroaches, they will be to you too. Seriously, I'm just sharing you. I don't know if this is helping you or depressing you. Unfortunately, I can tell you, but it's like the march on March 24th. If you marched here in Milwaukee, didn't you feel consoled and heartened and energized? And this is the way it works. And then it becomes contagious. There's something about, to be a hopeful person, you have to go to the edge of despair, where there's no hope whatsoever, and maintain your hope. And we're going to keep doing that and experimenting with gospel nonviolence. And then justice and disarmament and environmental sustainability are inevitable.
All right, at this rate, we can take one more question.
I'm sure you know that Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Dorothy Day follow the idea not only of nonviolence and activism, but also encourage the bringing together of the oppressor and the oppressed, and engaging with the oppressor. And that's some of the hardest things that I find going through all of this. And I'm wondering if any of you could speak to that, how to engage with the oppressor, and moving forward with that.
It's a great question. One of the things that I learned from the book I mentioned earlier, Frantz, Fanon, and Psychology of Oppression, is how we divide the world using a technique called the Manichaean Psychology, which divides every oppressive society in the same way. So you have people on the oppressed side and people on the oppressor side. And what this Manichaean Psychology does is it teaches you, depending on which side you're on, how to see yourself, So if you're on the oppressor side, you're taught to think of the group that you belong to in very positive terms. You're the most intelligent, you're the most beautiful, you're the most morally correct people within society. But if you're on the other side, you're taught to think of yourself in the exact opposite way. So what I suggest we have to do is we have to begin to convince people who are on the oppressor side that you're not all that. You've been lied to. You've been cheated out of a real understanding of who you are because you've developed this sense of superiority, and the people on the other side have been taught that they are inferior. So what you have to do is you have to really break down by educating people why this division takes place and who really benefits from it. So when you're able to teach people how that the system itself, how the institutions within the nation benefit a small group of people to the detriment of everybody else, those people who are on the oppressor side, who just happen to be in the group, they have to understand that the history of America, particularly the last 50 years or so, that what we see that people of color have endured forever in this country, that these things are now landing on the doorstep of white people. And for the first time in American history, white people are waking up and realizing that this is not my grandfather's America anymore. This is why the highest suicide rates in the country are among white men. This is why the greatest growth in the opioid epidemic is in white communities, not within, these central cities. Because white people are waking up to a realization that for the first time, America is not what they thought it was. And they have to understand that you've been cheated into believing that there are things that come along with being a white person in America that you are entitled to, that you're no longer entitled to. That entitlement is gone permanently. And once they wake up to that realization, they'll realize that they are in the same boat as the people who've been oppressed for a very long period of time in America. And once you come to that realization, you recognize the need to come together and unite with people across different boundaries. This is part of what I've been doing by reaching out to the suburban communities in Milwaukee, to rural communities around the state of Wisconsin, making people recognize that all of these things that we're dealing with, the forced changes to our economy that are impacting so many people, that we're all in the same boat. We've just been taught to think we're in different boats, and we've been taught to continue to see ourselves as different groups. Dividing and conquering has been a technique that's been used for thousands of years. It still works. The only way you get past it is to recognize that there are people who want to divide us. There are people that want us to stay divided so that they can get everything they want. And I hate to quote this particular individual, but I read something in a class I took years ago that Adolf Hitler said this. He said, talking to some of his leaders of the Nazi Party, he said, "It's good for us that the people don't pay attention." We have to start paying attention. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Reggie. I hope you all invite Reggie to speak in your communities around Milwaukee. I hear you saying we're all in the same boat to get to the place where we're neither oppressed nor oppressors, neither victims nor victimizers, and then you're moving into universal nonviolent love. For me, as a privileged person, it's a downward mobility journey, and that's why I travel into war zones of the world and try to go to jail regularly and be really mindful about where and how I live and with whom I. But to answer your question, I'm working nationally with Campaign Nonviolence to organize nationally, trying to keep the movement moving and to help each other connect the dots and to use Dr. King's weapon of nonviolence as a powerful way to transform our culture. But we have this campaign at Los Alamos, and I can go up there and get really angry because they're planning the end of the world. I mean, it's the ultimate terrorist training camp on the planet. We used to have those rallies 15 years ago, like the president was saying, we're killing kids in Iraq because we're looking for weapons of mass destruction. And we'd say, there aren't any over there. We found them. They're right here in our backyard. Well, that didn't go over very well, but you get the point. But we learned in these campaigns trying to practice Gandhian Satyagraha and nonviolence at Los Alamos. We have an annual sackcloth and ashes action based on the book of Jonah. Okay, it's a little over the top, but you see the point. And we can't point the fingers at them. I mean, the worst in us that wants to go down that route can't. We actually need the people at Los Alamos. They're the only ones who know how to get rid of the darn things. And we learned that through the personal relationships with them. Because we're literally all in the same boat now as we look at the end of the world at Los Alamos and the end of the earth. What is happening there is going to happen to the whole planet now. And so it's easy to practice nonviolent love there, and it's always a gentle invitation. Quit your jobs. Pursue the life of nonviolence. Lead the movement for disarmament and for justice and for sustainability. We're all one human race. Every human being is a sister and brother of one another now. And that's the way out, and that's the heart of nonviolence. That's why you could define nonviolence, Reggie, and this will be my last word, Jennifer, theoretically, as remembering who we are. I loved your trying to define violence. So important as leading toward early death. You could also define it as forgetting who we are. Anything that makes us forget you're the infinitely loved son or daughter of the God of peace, sister or brother of everybody, one with creation, leads you to dehumanize others, to name them as enemy or the other, and then to bring death to them. You and I want to wake up like Martin and be the people who remember every day who we are, beloved by the God of peace, the Creator, one with all of each other, and we're going forward to help wake up everybody and to end all the violence and death and welcome a new culture of peace and nonviolence. Thank you so much for being part of this. Carry on your great work here in Milwaukee. You live in a very important place. You do. And you have so much potential to be a light to the country. And we have to keep doing this till the day we die. And it's the best thing we can do with our lives. And I look forward to meeting you all and signing books. And I wish you all the best. God bless. Thanks for having me.